introduce the morning keynote.
Hi, thank you, Brian. I am so thrilled and honored to be able to introduce Dr. Isabela Granic here, who I met 4 years ago at Meaningful Play, who has a PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Toronto and had a little experience and exposure to the field of games research, games for change, positive games. And she came here to this conference. And it was awesome to meet her and talk to her about where she was going. A couple years later, she published an amazing article in a top journal, American Psychologist, about the positive impacts of gaming. I use that article in my class every year. I use it in the beginning of my talks when I try to set the stage for the cognitive, social, and emotional benefits of gaming. And so Dr. Granic was kind enough to accept my invitation after I had sent her so much praise about her work, and I've cited it and mentioned it many times. She was kind enough to accept the invitation to come and give a keynote here. She's not only currently a professor and the chair of the department at the University of Radboud in the Netherlands, but she is also a co-founder of the Play Nice Institute, which aims to take some of her research work and turn it into products that make a real impact out in society. And her co-founder of the Play Nice Institute is also here. So I don't want to take up much of her time. Thank you so much, Isabela. Let's give her a round.
There's only 4 black buttons. Okay. Thank you, Robbie, and thank you for inviting me and for all of you coming to my talk. So today what I want to talk to you about is a program of research that's been going on for about 4.5 years or so. So in some ways it's really in its infancy, at least in academic psychology science terms. And indeed, this was my first gaming conference that I ever went to, and I felt very welcome, and I learned a lot from the talks that I came to attend, and so it's really quite nice to kind of come full circle and tell you about what we've been doing since that time. So, as Robbie said, I'm a prof right now at Radboud University, and before that and during some of that period of time, I've been doing research for about 18 years actually, in trying to look at the kinds of programs that work for children who are anxious and depressed and their families. And we went through decades of research trying to figure out what kinds of interventions are going to be most effective for these kids. And basically what brought me to games was I was starting to get extremely frustrated with the small to moderate effect sizes that we got with the best evidence-based programs. What that means in real terms is that approximately 40 to 60% of young people would not benefit from the absolute best evidence-based practices. And I thought, what the hell, we need to be able to do something better. So I came to games with the kind of hope that we could find a different delivery system for the kinds of scientific principles we knew in theory would work to decrease anxiety and depression, but weren't working as well as they could be. And I'll tell you a little bit about why. So the problem. I'm going to focus mostly on anxiety, but there is about a 75% overlap between anxiety and depression. So really when I'm talking about anxiety, I'm also talking about Oh no, that's really bad. Okay, so I can say a little better. Okay, I'll switch it up. I can't use the handheld ones because I flap my arms too much. And I also walk around a lot, so we'll see how it is. Okay, so I'm going to focus a little bit on anxiety right now. We know from hundreds of years of scientific inquiry, starting from Darwin, but also from Freud, that anxiety arises in situations that are ambiguous, that are potentially threatening, and potentially is the really important part of this point, and unpredictable. Okay, and there are a whole lot of people that are suffering from anxiety and depression. The World Health Organization has declared for many years that anxiety and depression are the leading cause of disability worldwide. It is not only in North America, but in the EU and Asia as well. 1 in 4 kids epidemiological studies are showing these numbers. 1 in 4 kids, by the time they reach 18, will be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or depression. That's clinically elevated. So in this room right now, either we ourselves have suffered from anxiety or depression, or we know somebody very close to us who have. So this is not some esoteric issue or mental health problem that we're not close to. It's a really, really important problem that we need to address for a whole host of reasons that I don't have time to get into, but obviously the suffering that it inflicts on people. So in terms of prevention and treatment, as I said, one of the big problems after decades of research is that we still have small to moderate effect sizes out of our best treatment and prevention programs. When I talk about prevention, by the way, I'm talking about people who are showing elevated signs of anxiety or depressive symptoms but haven't been clinically diagnosed. And so we want to do prevention programs, usually in school contexts, but also in agencies and other kinds of contexts, to try to prevent them from going into full-blown anxiety and depression. The other issue is that 80% of kids don't seek treatment, and there's a whole host of reasons why that is, but probably the biggest one is stigma. You don't get a lot of teenagers saying, "Hi, miss, I'm depressed, can I get some help?" It doesn't happen. And so there's a detection problem trying to get the kids that need the help they need at a time where they might be able to benefit from the skills that they can learn. And so stigma and detection is a real problem. And so what we've done is skipping really quickly into going into games and trying to look at games as a medium by which we can address the kinds of gaps that we're seeing in more conventional prevention and treatment programs. So let me just tell you why video games seem to be these kinds of ideal. Now, if I was talking to a group of psychologists and mental health people, I would have to go through about 10 slides telling them that video games are not a bad thing. So I'm going to skip that part for you guys. And tell you specifically why video games might be a great thing for mental health. So first and foremost, engagement. In our conventional treatment programs, what we usually do, let me focus only on prevention right now. What we usually do is go into classrooms of 30, 40 kids, and we do this kind of thing. It's a didactic kind of teaching. We tell children the kinds of thinking traps they get stuck into, the way they can change those thinking traps, how to think more positively, how to breathe, and so on. But we do it in this kind of really teaching, top-down way. Kids are bored, completely disengaged. Obviously, we know that video games can engage them in a very different way. The other issue in conventional programs is that it's really hard to get kids to practice the emotional resilience skills that we want them to practice in this kind of cold didactic context. They're not feeling authentically the emotions that they have difficulty with, so anxiety, loss, guilt, and so on. And so we can't get them to practice in vivo the kinds of skills we want when they're actually feeling those negative emotions that we want them to help them through. Video games provide us a great opportunity to basically instill or trigger those negative emotions and then give them an opportunity to learn skills while in the game to get out of those negative emotions. Cost and access is a given, okay? Obviously, video games are going to be cheaper than face-to-face therapies or therapies that go through schools. And access, there's a huge issue in mental health delivery systems where a lot of people can't access the kinds of treatment programs and prevention programs video games deal with really nicely. All right, let's see. Without blowing your ears out. Sorry. Thanks, Ryan. Okay. The other, as I said, stigma is a huge issue with mental health programs. We can't get kids to ask for the help that they really need. And so games, of course, are these like lovely Trojan horses getting us into the homes and the schools of kids, getting them to play games that they may intrinsically love to play without the stigma of feeling that they're doing so because there's something wrong with them. And then personalization is a huge deal. So when, as I said, when we usually do these kind of conventional treatment programs or prevention programs, we give one program, manualized, let's say 12 weeks, to a classroom. It's the same program though. And we all know that people suffer from anxiety and depression for a whole host of different reasons. And they cope with it and learn new skills in a whole host of different ways. And what games can help us do is tweak dynamically to each individual person that comes to the game and to try to match where they are skills-wise with what they can be provided with the game. And I can tell you a little bit more about how we want to use machine learning to do this kind of personalization of interventions. So what we have developed is what we're calling the GEM framework, because we have to have a name for it. It's Games for Emotional and Mental Health. And I want to tell you a little bit about this framework because it's a little different from maybe the kinds of things that you've so far been exposed to, although there's a lot of resonance with some of the education and medical fields and the applied games that are developed there. So what we do in our lab has three main components. Of course, we do research, so everything we're trying to do is going to be evidence-based. We have a strong emphasis on disseminating the products that we eventually have as evidence-based, and there's a whole different ways of doing that that we can talk about. And then we have a multidisciplinary team that is involved in game design in-house now. So our mission is to disrupt how mental health interventions are designed, delivered, and experienced. And this is really, really important because it really, again, some of this might feel really obvious to you about what games can do, but from the conventional mental health field, the medicalized sort of model, this is a really different kind of way of thinking about how we deliver our interventions. So of course we start with a very strong foundation of scientific principles and practice. There's decades of work in clinical psychology that have shown us that there are certain techniques that work and work consistently as long as we have kids engaged with what we're trying to teach them, right? So we start with these scientific principles and practices. But then in terms of the design, as I said, we're a multidisciplinary team. We try very hard, and I have learned over the last 4 years how important it is to not privilege science over the art of design. So this is actually very, very different from my colleagues in the kind of serious games world, where they usually come from the science thing, and it's a very top-down, we have to come from science, and they walk down the hallway and ask the programmer that they've been working on their statistics with to make them a game. Okay? That's not what we do. We are very respectful of disciplines that have educated people in design and art. We try to bring them into our process. We have an evidence-based iterative testing procedure that we continue to iteratively develop because we've made a lot of mistakes. And we bring in youth, so stakeholders usually are our youth. So adolescents come in and tell us what they're playing, why they're playing it, how they're playing it, and then when we tell them our ideas, they usually laugh at us and tell us how we should do it better, which is awesome. It's really, really great to work with these kids. And I don't call them kids at that time. Okay, and then in terms of delivery, what we want to try to do, what generally in mental health, there's a very top-down, again, approach of telling kids, this is what you need to do to get better, okay? And it makes it a very paternalistic kind of experience, and often kids are not engaged in that, in those interventions for that reason. So what we would like is this kind of pull model. We want kids to pull the games off the shelf, pull the interventions to them, rather than us pushing it to them. So we're really thinking about how to do that. We want kids to feel like they have autonomy and choice about what kinds of games would help them in terms of their own mental health healing. We want to make our games commercial and accessible, and if this was a purely scientific world, I would hear boos and hisses, or at least I would hear them under their voice, because this is a huge issue in terms of scientific integrity, and how to do this, how to commercialize our products that are evidence-based is a real big problem, but that's one of the main reasons I came to games, is because I don't want to keep our conventional, our programs in the ivory tower. I want to get them in the hands of the kids that it's going to make the biggest difference with. And so this is one way to do that, and one really important way to do that is to commercialize. And then we want to get into the social networks and make it relevant for kids. So that's the delivery system in terms of our games. And then finally, we want kids to experience the intervention games as relevant to them. We want them to feel respected, empowered, inspired, and participating in the process of getting these games into their own hands and feeling like they're doing it for themselves, not just having this thing done to them. And in general, we hope that our games are going to look a little more like the games that they are playing in everyday life. And there's a lot of great games out there that are under the serious game rubric. And I respect the work that's been done in that area tremendously, but I do know that kids think they're boring. And I have to say it just straight up, we need better games that look like the kinds of games that they're playing. Okay, I love this quote from Tolstoy. Real science studies and makes accessible that knowledge which people at that period of history think important. And real art transfers this truth from the domain of knowledge to the domain of feelings. So this is what I'm trying to kind of infuse into my graduate students, that it's about respecting the art of games and how they can transform people's lives rather than just thinking about the scientific principles. We're not throwing out the scientific principles, but we want to bring in the art as well. I'm very inspired by, how many of you guys know Maurice Sendak? Like everybody, I hope? Yeah. The coolest thing about this is that I can go to the Netherlands, I can go to China, I can go anywhere and everybody knows this picture. So Maurice Sendak is awesome, and he just died recently, unfortunately. But he used to talk about the fact that most writers who write for children, which he completely was against the idea, talk down to them, and they do not actually write and provide experiences that kids can resonate with, which are a lot about negative emotions. They're a lot about the kinds of anger, frustration, guilt, sadness, all sorts of wide-ranging emotions that kids experience, and we usually, in our games, when we're trying to do games for good, for kids especially, don't focus on these negative emotions. He used to say, grown-ups desperately need to feel safe, and then they project onto the kids. But what none of us seem to realize is how smart kids are. They don't like what we write for them, what we dish up for them, because it's vapid. So they'll go for the hard words, they'll go for the hard concepts, they'll go for the stuff where they can learn something. Not didactic things, but passionate things. And that's what we're really trying to do, is to try to provide games and experiences in games that trigger negative emotions so that kids can then learn to regulate those emotions in-game, to grind on certain mechanics that help them learn and practice the skills that help them get over negative emotions. And that's where they feel authentic optimism and empowerment. And of course, you all know that games are emotional. Usually I put this slide up, and most of my psychologist people have no idea what any of these games are. Most of you probably know them all, and they're probably old school to you. But the point here is just that games can trigger a huge wide range of emotions, including guilt, awe, anger, sadness. I mean, 5 minutes of passage, I just take a couple of people and make them play that game, and I mean, at least 80% get a little tear in their eye. I mean, it's an amazing thing what these experiences can bring to people. And so we want to be able to have these kinds of experiences be in the hands of kids who are trying to overcome anxiety and depressive symptoms. And we work with, and this is really important, I'm not doing this on my own, obviously, we work with design collaborators from all over the place, and these are just a few of our collaborators. I don't have time to actually get into names and so on, but I'll tell you a little bit about the projects that they're involved in. But the idea is, again, to bring these people into the project so that we can learn and also infuse our science with the art and design that's going to be so captivating for kids. So the general idea in the way that we work is we bring in the academics, the scientists, and so on. We bring in the youth, players, whatever you may call them. And then we also work with clinicians that have been working with kids for decades themselves, face-to-face with these kids, and know the kinds of experiences they have. And then we bring in the game designers and artists, and together we talk about the research and the design. We then design games in this collaborative way, and then we do research both in terms of outcomes, so does anxiety and depression go down as a function of, we do randomized controlled trials all the time to try to figure out what the effect of our games are, and then we also do process research, which is really about the in-game behaviors that are most associated with the outcomes that we want to get at. And the idea is that this is an iterative process, so that as we do the research, we learn what is most effective in the games and what is least effective, and I'll show you an example of that. And then we try to disseminate it into mental health institutes as well as schools, and then we want to try to commercialize as well. We're just in the process of trying to figure out that model. Okay, so here's the idea. We take these scientific principles that are out there in the literature, research literature, and then we translate them into game mechanics. Okay? We translate things like exposure therapy into a game mechanic that I'll show you an example about in a second. We then have a hypothesis or a hope, in some cases a prayer, that it's going to change something internally in the minds of these children. And of course, we have happy, healthy people, right? So it seems really, really simple. In fact, it's a ridiculously complex problem. I'm not going to get into this, and you guys know this better than any of the people that I speak to in terms of mental health processes, but there's a whole lot of prototyping and thinking about both the game design and their goals, as well as the psychological change goals that we have. And we iterate on this vision over and over and do pilots. This is all before any code, any kind of programming, anything like that, okay? And this is really important for us because all of our funding comes from usually government agencies. And even though right now we're actually doing quite well in terms of the science funding, it's not a lot for product development. So we want to try to do all of this before any kind of programming goes on. I love this quote too. You can use an eraser on the drafting table or a sledgehammer on the construction site. This is deeply important for us as we're trying to save money before we can actually get to the game. But once we have a prototype, a playable prototype, something that you can actually work on, what's really important for us is to think about, this only took me like 3 years just to come up with these 2 lines, 3 years, okay? Because they are 2 different things, okay? The process of game design and iteratively doing the game, making the game better and better, is separate from, although related, to the intervention design, okay? They are absolutely iteratively connected to one another, and especially at the beginning, but they are separate and different, and they need to be looked at as such. So, for example, if I just take this little chunk at the beginning here, after we have our first prototype, we want to think of things in terms of the game design. Do we have kids engaged? Do we have them saying this is fun? Are they having fun while they do it? Do we have the ramp up right? Are they getting the mechanic quick enough so that they understand what the hell they're doing? You guys all know what I'm talking about. It's such a great thing. I don't have to explain what the ramp up is. But in terms of the intervention design, I want to know, have I triggered anxiety? Have I triggered anger? The kinds of things I wanted to trigger in the game so that they're going to learn how to regulate those emotions. Do I have reactants? Do I have kids saying, you know what, this sucks, this is so boring, I know exactly what they're trying to do to us, which they say really openly. Cognitive load, how much are they having to keep in their minds while they're trying to do it, and is it too much, can they not do it? So those are the intervention design goals, which are separate from the game design goals, although they are interrelated, right? Then after we've got some data from those 2 things, there is another prototype that is iterated on and hopefully improved. And then we have more advanced kinds of things that we want to know about the game design. Things like engagement still, but does the mechanic work in the way that we want it to work throughout the game? Is there replayability? Do they want to pick it up again? In terms of the intervention design, I want to know, have I had an impact on anxiety symptoms? Have I had an impact on depressive symptoms? Do I have, if it's a social game, is there more connection or social bonding and so on? So it's really important, this process for us. And we continue to iterate on how to do that and how to talk to one another in this way. So let me give you an example of a couple of games. The first game that I'll talk to you about is MindLight. It's a neurofeedback video game, and it was designed to prevent and treat anxiety. We did it in collaboration with Gameplay Studios in the Netherlands. The names that I show you are my graduate students. I can barely pronounce them, so just read them, okay? But these are the people who are doing all of the hard work of actually getting this stuff done. So with MindLight, the idea is that you wear a 1-channel EEG headset. It's really easy to put on. I'll show you an example in a second. And it reads your brainwaves, frontal brainwaves, alpha, beta, theta waves. Those correspond to either relaxation states or anxious states, or focused attention and non-focused attention. Those are the 2 types of things that basically you can get with a 1-channel EEG. You do not get things like positive versus negative emotions and so on, but that's all we needed for this, okay? That data directly gets inputted into the game, so it's basically you're using your mind as the joystick in the game, okay? As you get more relaxed, the light grows in this haunted house context in a game. When you get anxious, it grows darker, okay? And the idea is to reclaim or regain your calm as you use relaxation techniques like breathing or muscle tension exercises and so on. Your light grows again and you can proceed, okay? We use 2 evidence-based practices that we know from clinical psychology work. Exposure therapy, which is basically, psychologists are so brilliant. Here's the science. We basically throw people off a cliff, and they realize actually it wasn't that far down, and I'm okay. That's basically exposure therapy, okay? People who are, and it works. It actually is one of our biggest success cases in clinical psychology, okay? You're afraid of dogs, we'll bring the dog into the room from over there, then we'll bring it closer and closer, and we'll force you to do deep breathing exercises. And as you do that, you realize, hey, I'm surviving, I'm not losing my mind, and this is starting to work, and this is exposure therapy. It works really, really well. So we put that technique into the game. Kids have to expose themselves to fearful things while staying calm. And then we use attention bias modification. So attention bias modification, when you are anxious, when anyone is anxious, you don't have to be anxiety disordered, you tend to look only at the threatening cues in your environment, and you are hyper-vigilant towards those threats. So if I'm giving a talk and I am anxious when I'm giving a talk, all I'm going to see is the faces that are like that. And I won't look at the smiling, friendly faces. I won't pay attention to those because I will be hyper-vigilant to the negative cues. What we try to do with attention bias modification is to do a training program where you have to, and you're rewarded, to attend to positive cues and to disattend to negative cues. And if you do that a number of times, your attentional cognitive system starts getting trained up to actually start paying attention to other cues in the environment. So this works for a whole host of anxiety issues, and we put that into the game in the context of the puzzles. Okay, so let me just show you a little bit of the game. So you have to approach these scary looking things, stay calm, the light grows, and you unquote these negative. You're taught at the beginning how to shine your light by using different kinds of techniques. This is an attention bias puzzle. You have to look for the happy face, ignore the negative ones, and focus your attention there. Designed for 8 to 12-year-olds, but even 16-year-olds are pretty into it. Because we're doing it with your mind. About 8 hours of gameplay, it becomes harder and harder, and so the threshold to get your light shining becomes higher and higher, so you have to do more for longer periods. And shine the light onto, focus your attention on these lights, and ignore the negative stuff around you, and if you can light the light, then that place becomes a safe zone. Remember that happy faces, I got this today. The only way, you can't shoot those guys, but if you turn around and use your light on them, that's what gets them relevant. So you get the idea. Okay, so what we try to do, that was the fastest that anyone's ever gotten that joke, by the way, whoever just laughed at this. So what we try to do is we try to first and foremost test our design. Were these kids engaged with what we designed them for? Were they actually looking at the scary monsters? Were they scared by them? And so we do a whole lot of work in terms of videotaping kids' faces while they're playing the games, and then second by second coding them. I've now met a couple of people that are doing facial recognition that are going to save my life and a lot of budget by having automatic facial detection. But for now, we were doing second by second coding. coding of the emotions to make sure, again, that we get things like anxiety, surprise, but also focused attention and so on. Just to give you an idea of what our trials look like in the schools, I'll show you how easily the kids can put these things on, but also the kind of school context that this is being done in. So this is the first randomized controlled trial we did with kids. Kids can easily put this thing on by themselves.
I've just seen a face I can't
So these are the faces we're trying to get, right?
We just met, she's just a girl from me, and I don't want all the world to see we met.
We also want to see, we're trying to look at things like nail biting, which is anxiety.
Another day, I might have looked the other way, and I'd have never been aware. But I said, as I'll dream of her tonight. Falling, yes, I'm falling.
And they're taught different kinds of strategies to calm themselves down. One is breathing, the other is muscle relaxation, and another one is self-talk. Just self-talk, so to bring yourself down and talk to yourselves. That's another sign of anxiety, writing on the very self-talking, and so on. Okay, so that's what our research looks like. Really nicely last year we got a nomination for Games for Most Significant Impacts from Games for Change, which is at least we're getting on the right track with what we're doing with our games. And then of course, really, really, really importantly, because this is actually the bread and butter in terms of my academic career, is I have to show that this stuff works, right? And that it works at least as well, or well, at least it should work in terms of decreasing anxiety, because that's what it was tested for. We don't want to just say that the game was fun for kids, right? So what we do is we run randomized controlled trial. I'm going to show you, just for time's sake, our second randomized controlled trial. We've done 3 randomized controlled trials. All 3 of them show basically this exact effect. But I'll show you the second one because it's really important in terms of the comparison group. So what we did was, this was a non-inferiority trial. So what that means is that we had hypothesized and we registered the trial to say that we're going to compare kids who go through MindLight versus kids who go through cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the gold standard. 60,000 meta-analyses have established that cognitive behavioral therapy works for kids with anxiety problems. The problem is the kids are bored out of their mind, they're unengaged, and they feel like they're forced into it. But it works if they stay in it, okay? So cognitive behavioral therapy, gold standard of therapy when it comes to anxiety, right? So what we did was we had 1,200 kids, 8 to 12-year-olds who were screened for anxiety symptoms. We picked those who were in the subclinical, they scored high on anxiety. And that was about 170 kids. And then those 170 were randomly assigned either to be in the MindLight group or to the cognitive behavioral therapy group. They went for 8 weeks in the CBT group. They played the game for 7 weeks or 8 weeks for some of them. But generally 7 or 8 weeks, okay? And so I'm going to show you the results. What I'm going to show you now is their self-reported anxiety symptoms. So how, they're asked, are you scared of the dark? Are you scared to be alone in the house? Scared to approach other friends, and so on. So it's a questionnaire that asks them about their own anxiety. We get the exact same symptoms, we get the exact same results where we ask parents about the children's own anxiety problems. And then we also get the same results when we look at physiological reactions of children to a stressful situation and how fast they would recover from that stress. This is really important. So this is not just a self-report bias, but this is the most straightforward way to look at the data. Okay, total anxiety. This is before they started the game or cognitive behavioral therapy. They're elevated in their anxiety symptoms. Post is 8 weeks later. We get a drop of almost half in terms of their anxiety symptoms. 3 months after they've stopped treatment and they haven't played the game, and we see that their anxiety continues to decrease after this, okay? This is awesome. The fact that they've learned something and they've generalized into their real world is something that is not shown generally, even in actual therapy that is not cognitive behavioral therapy. Often you don't see this follow-up result. Then we looked at cognitive behavioral therapy, and you get the exact same result, okay? And this is actually really, really good news. If CBT didn't work, we would have sucked because we know CBT generally works, right? But now we have a game that kids can play on their own 50 minutes per week, so 50 minutes once a week, and we get the same result in terms of decreases in anxiety as face-to-face therapy. Okay, so this was huge for us. We've seen 3 randomized controlled trial with Mindlight's kids going down in anxiety now. So this is, one of them was a separate lab study in Canada, so we're really, really encouraged by this. Okay, so this is really important for us, but then we also want to know if the mechanisms that we actually designed into the game are the causal reasons why the game is working. And this goes back to a whole controversy, not even controversy, in the therapy literature, where there's a lot of what we call non-specific factors that drives a lot of the improvements that we see in people who go through therapies. Things like the alliance between the therapists, things like motivation, hope, expectations that things will work, actually drives a lot of the improvements, which is great. But you also want to know, do we get something extra by the actual design, right? So one of the main things is we tell kids in conventional therapy, look, if you just change the way that you think, the world out there is going to change in response to you. And they look at us and they think we're full of shit. Don't believe us. And they're right, kind of, you know? They just look at us and no, it's not going to happen. And so one of the reasons why we went to this kind of EEG feedback system is it seemed to me like it would be a great metaphor. These kids are changing their mind and they see something changing outside in the world on their computer, right? And so that's one of the mechanisms by which we think it works. But it may not be that you have to have perfectly accurate neurofeedback data. It may be that heart rate works similar to that, and it may be that the metaphor itself is important enough, rather than the specific alpha, beta, theta waves being the correct ones going into the game. So we're looking at that right now and using sham experiments where we get people with accurate neurofeedback versus non-accurate neurofeedback, and seeing whether it's actually the accurate neurofeedback that you need or just, again, the metaphor that's taking the change. I don't have the results for that yet. But we also did real-time coding of in-game behavior. Please kill me now. We spent 8 months, 4 graduate students trained for 2 months to look at every single second in the game and code what was going on. Okay? Were they approaching? Were they avoiding? How long did they stay in front of things? And I'll just summarize it because the coding system is literally 4 pages long, and those are the summary codes. And just to tell you the kinds of things that we coded. So what we're trying to get here is, was the design of the game, the mechanics in the game, the actual thing that caused the drop in anxiety? So we coded for how often and how long did they stay in these chests. There's these chests in Mindlight that they can go and hide in. If you hide, you're safe. But there's lots of theoretical reasons why we actually don't want kids to hide for much longer than at the beginning of the game, because you want them to be exposed to negative stuff, right? So we coded for the duration in these chests. We coded for how often they went and turned on the lights in the game so that they created safe zones for them. That's cool at the beginning, but we don't want them to continue to do that, because we want them to start feeling more and more brave and go out there and expose themselves. And then we also coded for how much exploration they did, how much they went up to fearful things in there, okay? And we wanted that to change over the course of treatment as well. And here's what we find. Decreases in the duration that they spent in the chests from pre to post-treatment predicted, in a very highly significant way, improvements in anxiety 3 months later. So that means something in the actual mechanic of the design of the game is predicting, so the extent to which kids hid in these chests, or didn't actually, was predictive of their improvements in anxiety 3 months later. Decreases in the frequency of turning lights, so basically decreases in safety behaviors and what we call them in therapy, was also predictive of improvements in anxiety 3 months later. And increases in exploration also predicted improvements in anxiety. And what's important here is that we know now that those things are important in terms of the design of the game. It's just as important to tell you that those attention bias modification puzzles sucked and did not predict improvements. And remember I said, look at that happy face? They were creepy. They weren't actually happy positive cues. We only realized later on. We thought they were great. And so this is really important kind of work to do because it's not just about getting an evidence-based game, but it's also figuring out what parts of the game work and what parts don't, so you can take it out and tailor the games to get them more and more effective. So this is really important for us as well. Okay, next steps for Mindland at least is to port it to mobile now that we have 3 RCTs saying that it works, using heart rate variability, things like the Fitbit rather than the neurofeedback, just to get it to more people. And commercializing it, as well as trying to do then research once it's commercialized on the uptake, because what we want to know is, do we have an impact? I went into this thinking that games can have a much bigger impact. Are we going to have that kind of impact in terms of how many people actually get the game? Okay, in the last 15 minutes, I'm going to go on to the research. I want to tell you about another game that we're working on, which is called Deep VR. Has anyone heard of Deep VR? One person, excellent. Okay, this is a beautiful game. We're working really closely with Owen Harris and Nikki Smith, who are the artists and designers on the game. It's a virtual reality game, and the way it works, it's also biofeedback of sorts. You wear a breathing belt around your diaphragm. And this is a belt that was totally hacked by Owen, literally like sewn by him, which expands and contracts, and that's the raw data that goes into the VR game, okay? So this is, the belt goes on around you, you sit or stand, and then you go into an underwater, deep sea kind of environment. Let the designers tell. This is at Tribeca, the designers were talking about it.
Deep VR is a meditative virtual reality game that you control by breathing.
Like a lot of people, I've had problems with anxiety and occasional bouts of depression as well. Over the years, I've found one of the most effective ways for me to navigate those times is through breathing exercises, pranayama yoga, and meditation. It so happened that when the Oculus Rift was first hitting Kickstarter, I was going through a particularly difficult time, something that was rather intense. When my Oculus finally arrived, I started to build meditation chambers, star fields and oceanscapes to just kind of sit in, to just be outside of the world that was kind of causing me these problems. Eventually it occurred to me that perhaps it would be possible to incorporate the breathing exercises as well. And so from there, I managed to hack together some early versions of the breathing controller using the Arduino and some stretch sensors and a lot of Googling. So the controller that we have uses a slide sensor that we wrap around your waist, and as you breathe in and out, it tracks that movement and sends it to the game.
Games are the way to connect to people in a sort of healthy way, it's our Trojan horse into doing healthy stuff.
So we're working with the Radboud Institute in the Netherlands, investigating the impact of the game at teenagers with issues with anxiety, depression, and anger. And with them, we're developing a series of prototypes that are going to be tested in a variety of health institutions in the Netherlands. On the other hand, we also want to...
So I'll tell you a little bit about those prototypes in a second. So again, with Deep, we test the emotional design in terms of trying to look at the videotapes of the responses of the children. And then we also are doing some really interesting, fun work with folks who understand, at University of Geneva, who understand machine learning algorithms. So these are, for example, you can start in the game as the whole point is to get people to start breathing deeply. And this is much harder than you can imagine. And breathing not from their chest, but through the diaphragm. That's the most efficient way to physiologically downregulate. And it's basically the coolest thing that you have, the coolest technology in your body, basically, to get you to downregulate and feel less anxious and to be able to do a whole host of other things. So the idea here is to get people to get into that state, but people often don't get it. So you don't see my cursor. What you see at the top is one example. Each one is a different person, okay? So you get very different patterns of learning that happen when people get into the game. And what we're trying to figure out, that middle one is an example of somebody who was doing some very shallow breathing. So the higher it is, the deeper the breath is. So you see that they're basically stuck on the bottom of this undersea world. And as you breathe in and out deeper, you're able to move around. Otherwise, you get stuck at the bottom, you can't go anywhere. And so that's the way you're rewarded for the deep breathing. But you can see that there's actually some signs, and we call them catastrophe flags for reasons I'm not going to get into, but basically there may be some early signs of just before people start getting it, right? And if we can look at, hundreds, and now we're starting to get up to thousands of people, and their raw data about how they get these patterns finally, we can try to start to tune the game and the VR environment around these individual differences to support people who are just about to get it, right? And to not overwhelm them or pull back on the game and so on. So that we're trying to actually more efficiently teach people how to learn these skills through these kinds of learning algorithms. The evidence-based techniques that he was talking about, the series of prototypes that we're developing, we're trying to get these evidence-based scientific principles into the game, because this was just a great thing that this artist Owen kind of figured out for himself worked. But in fact, and it's a lovely, calm, restful environment, but there are also other things that we can do that we think are going to boost the effects. So things like mirroring. I'll just put this on and you can watch it while I talk. So with this, if you can see right now, when the breath is, when they exhale, the circle gets smaller. When they inhale, it gets bigger. But you see that the plants are reactive to this now. Okay, we just put this into the game right now in the last week. What's really important about that is the first step towards learning how to regulate your physiology is to be aware of it. And so most kids have no idea what their bodies actually feel like and what breathing in and out feels like. And so what you see here is this mirroring effect in the environment without having to talk to them and tell them in a didactic way, breathe in and out this way. They get to see it in their environment and learn about what their body feels like through that. So this is the mirroring aspect that we're putting in and seeing whether we have more efficient results in terms of anxiety reduction by this mirroring process. We're also using modeling, which is going to be when they see those little dolphin-y things. Well, there's actually more dolphin-y looking things. Those are not dolphins, actually. But we have dolphins and whales and such that are going to be going up and down in the environment, modeling the kind of breathing pattern we want, which is basically double the exhale as the inhale. So 3 seconds of inhale, 6 seconds out exhale is a kind of typical pattern that will get people physiologically downregulated. But we want to do this in a fun way so that they're going to be able to follow animals around this environment just by their breathing and getting it that way. Exposure is the same exposure that I talked to you about. So basically we're going to have freaky shows and dark caves, and we'll get people to get out of it and go through that experience and get the self-efficacy that they can go through that experience by just using their breath. So that's the exposure therapy, and we're going to try to see whether each one of these prototypes adds to the efficacy of our game. And then the last 5 minutes, I just want to tell you that we just got funding from the ERC, which is basically the National Science Foundation for all of the EU. It's a huge amount of wonderful funding that we get for 5 years to do some really innovative work. And what we're going to focus on is really taking these kinds of games and moving towards the social realm. We know that both anxiety and depression are really problems that have integrally to do with social connection. And I can go, that's a whole 1 hour talk, but we're trying to get games that work on a social level and can help people get through social anxiety, which is the actual most frequent kind of anxiety we have, as well as depression. So we're working with, for example, Journey and Robin Haneke has worked with us, and for the last 2 years we've done a randomized control trial using Journey to see whether kids with elevated levels of depression who play Journey compared to a control group and compared to Flower, you may not get the difference between those, have decreases in their depression symptoms. There's a whole host of reasons why the kinds of social experiences that you get in Journey may help, but one of them is actually exposure. You get exposed to these lovely social connections, but also you lose them repeatedly, okay? And we did studies where we looked at how kids with depressive symptoms felt about those losses, and they felt like shit. They felt horrible, right? And they attributed the loss of these partners in Journey to themselves. I suck at this game, nobody wants to play with me, oh, this is just another example of what generally is in my life. But what happens is that if you play it often enough, and this is what we saw in our early pilot, you start reappraising, which is what we try to teach in therapy, those lost contexts as this is not actually about me. I have to go to dinner sometimes too, and I get offline. And so there are these experiences that we try to scaffold for these kids so that they can get exposed to the loss and get through it, and then try to work through that.
It's fun and it's excitement.
Yeah, you don't need to. It's already. Okay, so we're also doing right now experiments where we get people to play Journey online as it's supposed to be, as a social game or not, and look at whether sensitivity to rejection decreases, but only in the context of the social game and not in the context when they're playing by themselves. Trying to see very specifically, testing a theoretical model that says that it is the social experience of loss, but then recovery from that loss that helps people get through depressive symptoms. And then finally, what we're doing is designing biofeedback prevention programs that are mobile, so that any context that people get stressed out in, they can use things like Fitbits that will buzz their mobile phones when they're highly stressed and give them exercises to train their emotional resilience in the context that they're feeling most stressed, and also providing contexts where they can reach out to friends and play these games while they're most stressed with other people. But importantly, I'm not thinking and I'm not feeling like technology is the only outlet in which we can affect anxiety, depression. These kinds of games need to be connected to other experiences that also provide face-to-face experiences and social contexts in which people are able to go outside with one another. And so it's not all about the games. They have to be embedded in these social contexts. And so we're learning all sorts of ways of using interactive design to think about how to connect with other people on and off people's devices. I'm not going to talk about this because I don't have time. Okay, and I'll just end with, games are really not just for us an intervention tool, but they're ways for us to test theories of psychological change. And beautifully, as I showed you with the coding, the modular nature of games is really ideal for doing these tightly controlled experiments where we can say, hey, we have a hypothesis that the social connection and exposure is important for depression. We can put it in a game or out of a game and test that hypothesis really rigorously. This is unprecedented when it comes to actual interventions that are face-to-face, because people are much mushier than that. You can't take components in and out of therapy in that same rigorous way. We can look at multiple synchronized sources of input and output in terms of biofeedback, so we can look at video or facial recognition, allowing for this kind of affective modeling in motivationally meaningful contexts, which is really important for us because we can do our research in ways that we know are important for these people in these contexts. And then finally, we can push forward theory as well as applied practices in mental health. So this is not just about games for me. This is about actually revolutionizing the way that we think about mental health interventions, period. Yes, games are a huge, great vehicle by which we can do that, but there's also lots of things that we can tell conventional therapists to do in terms of their exposure therapy, all sorts of other things that we can learn through these games. So we take our research now, and what we want to do is come up with, in the next 5 years with this funding, a sort of toolbox of validated mechanics. And with these validated mechanics, the idea is to try to commercialize not just the games, but also to disseminate to commercial entities these validated mechanics that we know have evidence base behind them. So that the ideas like working with Ardman, Play Nice Institute, and so on, to take those mechanics that we have now been able to say have a causal impact on anxiety and have them skinned. And so, for example, we don't have to have little Teru for Mindlight anymore. Okay, that's kind of cute, he's cool, whatever. But what if we had somebody like Hiccup? So it's like the mechanic is the same, but you have on top of it an overlay that kids have connected with already, that they identify with already. And to us, that would be just a beautiful kind of marriage where we think about commercialization. And that's where I think we can really have global impact in terms of prevalence rates. It's through that commercialization that prevalence rates, I think, could dramatically decrease. And so I'm going to end with inviting collaborations from machine learning people that we've already done, artists and storytellers, of course, and we're working with affective neuroscientists to get to our goals. And I need to thank all of the very many collaborators and members of the GEM Lab here, and thank you for listening. Questions? Yeah.
Do you have any games that work on adults, and if so, can I have one?
That's awesome. So, I mean, as funny as that is, even Limelight, what's weird, okay, it looks childish or something like that, but I mean, I demoed this thing in CS, and it was quite horrible. I was, a booth game kind of thing. And you had adults get really into it because of the novelty of seeing neurofeedback in a much more engaging way than looking at the brain waves. So I would say things like Journey and Deep are completely adult, just as sort of relevant for adults. And we try to make most of what we're trying to do relevant across the age span. But some things like Limelight may not be as relevant because of the storyline. But again, it can be skin. So any of you guys that feel like, you want some kind of side job or something like that, it can be really, the same mechanic easily work and should work actually for adults. Yeah.
Are you commercializing your breathing belt?
It's not mine, so I should really say that it's Owen who had the thing and literally sewed it. And then, I have to be on the call with him asking him for one every 3 months. So it's not, there is no commercial belt out like that. There are research breathing belt things out there, but they're enormously priced, like they're just ridiculous in the tens of thousands. But I think it should be out in a year. Certainly when Deep gets commercialized, when Owen and Nikki get it out on market, then they will have some way of having done that. Yeah.
Have you collected any data with either the mindful game or the deep game on its ability not to decrease anxiety long term, but on acute panic episodes in children?
Yeah, so I haven't, but I think actually that's one of the lowest hanging fruit and probably easier to have an impact on, because with panic attacks, one of the biggest things is if you learn that you have the technology right in your own body to regulate those panic attacks, and it's the anxiety about the panic attack, it's the anxiety about the anxiety that actually is the hardest thing to have to work on. And I think what happens with Deep, putting it on you immediately are in this incredibly immersive, down-regulating mode. If you can use it in a context right before you know those are the places where you'll peak, I think it could work really, really well, but we haven't done it ourselves yet. So no data yet. You could. Yeah.
So I recognize that Deep is kind of like subconscious, I guess. You're controlling your brain and you learn it that way. But in Mindlight, is it outside research, or something to teach the techniques for calming down, or does the game give you techniques for calming down?
Yeah, it's the game for sure. So you walk in to the game, you don't have the headset on yet, and you find very easily a chest that opens up, Tarot, the headset, you put Tarot the headset on, and he starts talking to you, the player, and says, hey, you gotta uncover the darkness of this haunted house, here's how you do it, the more you relax, the more your light grows, and he teaches things like deep breathing. He self-talks and says, hey, just tell yourself, calm down, little dude. He actually annoys the hell out of me by now. He says, hey, little dude, you can do this. And also in Dutch, so it's even more annoying. I can say it all in Dutch. So yeah, it's in the game, it's not outside of the game, so that's exactly why we tried to do it for that reason. Yeah.
So I see you're using NeuroSky, and NeuroSky offers its own suite of technologies, and I'm sure there are other people who are using it. So what's the space like? I don't want to call them competitors, but what are the other endeavors in this area looking like, and to what extent are you similar or different from them?
Yeah, so NeuroSky was chosen, we chose the NorthSky for the main reason being that it is the cheapest that works. Okay, so it's 99 bucks. Muse system is 400 and it's probably the closest competitor. NeuroSky is, also for me has been a real challenge because as a researcher, they're not open with their algorithm. So basically what I did was I brought the NeuroSky set into our lab with meditators and non-meditators and told the meditators basically to work on their different arousal levels, and they're much more able to do that. And I could see that it worked the way that I wanted to work. That was my functional goal, and I got that. Right now, I'm very frustrated because I can't get into the algorithm to figure out how I can tweak with some things. And so I have neuroscientists constantly asking me, yeah, but if you made alpha higher and beta lower, you could get the... So I can't do that right now.
But I mean, I meant more about the competitors in the larger space of, the games.
Yeah, I mean, all I can, in the games, there's very little, if nothing, that looks or is engaging. There's nothing that, I was at CES, I saw everything there was in neurofeedback. And in terms of the software, in terms of games, they truly deeply suck. This is a place you could really go, by the way. I mean, I don't say this lightly because I was completely shocked about this, right? And and you could use heart rate, which is a lot more, it's just a continuous data thingy that goes into the game, right? So whether it comes from heart rate or neurofeedback, you probably could get the same effect. The neurofeedback is just a little sexier. But there isn't very many games out there at all that I know of. If anybody can tell me one game that you've played that was really engaging, I know you can blow up trucks, but other than that, yeah.
So what kind of data
That's-
do you collect, and what kind of reports do you see on member stages?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
What kind of data and what kind of reports or comments do you have to, validate the engagement with your data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're, boring psychologists, but now we finally have the funding to have a back end, okay? Where we're hoping to actually get, in some periods of the game, people reporting how engaged they are in terms of their emotional experiences. We also have heart rate, so we know when they're getting really anxious, when they're getting so we know that kind of engagement. In terms of how they feel, we ask them, of course, would you recommend this game to somebody else? Would you play it again yourself? Would you want it at home? Those kinds of things, and we get quite high ratings. And importantly, we compared it to, for Mind Light, we compared it to Max and the Magic Marker, which is one of these 8 to 12-year-old games that all of them love, and it was equal to that in terms of how much fun they were having. We have a paper out there that's already published in Computers and Human Behavior that has all that in there. The one thing that we were not equal to Max was that we did not provide flow, but we did not really want to provide flow because we wanted to scare the genes out of these kids so they could learn how to get over it. So we weren't too